Good afternoon from New York City. My name is Harrison Fluss, and I am chairing today's book launch for Domenico Losurdo's Nietzsche, the Aristocratic Rebel. Losurdo tragically died in 2018, and unfortunately cannot be with us today as we discuss and celebrate the release of his book. He left behind a substantial intellectual legacy and was a pioneering Marxist scholar in the history of philosophy. The Aristocratic Rebel is arguably his most important work. It is also the most important Marxist work written on Nietzsche, superseding George Lukács's earlier critique from the destruction of reason. This supersession has a dialectical character. Losurdo deepens Lukács's critique of Nietzsche, eliminates its contingent aspects, and radically expands its scope. Losurdo's account goes beyond mere biography. It is a work of philosophy, politics, history, and a true encyclopedia of the 19th century. If you haven't already, I ask that you obtain a copy of this book and take the time to digest its contents. Even if you are a Nietzschean or are sympathetic to certain Nietzschean concepts, you owe it to yourself to read The Aristocratic Rebel. It is the most comprehensive engagement and critique of Nietzsche that you will find from a socialist perspective. My relationship with this book started when I was a student of continental philosophy. As I was developing my own perspective, Ishe Landa's essay from the New Left Review, Nietzsche, the Chinese worker's friend, was particularly game-changing for me. It was my first step towards an entire realm of critical Marxist scholarship about Nietzsche, and Losurdo's book is the most important example of this critical scholarship. However, The Aristocratic Rebel should not mean the end of it, but a new beginning for theory in the Anglophone world. Beyond liberal and postmodern readings, Losurdo's book shows that the future of Nietzsche's scholarship belongs to Marxism. For this event, we have three speakers that I'm very excited to introduce to you. Our first speaker is Benjamin Noyes, professor of critical theory at the University of Chester. Ben is the author of The Persistence of the Negative, Malign Velocities, and the forthcoming The Matter of Language. The title of his paper is Nietzsche's Revenge, which will discuss the theme of resentment. Our second speaker is Tiana Okic. Tiana holds a PhD in philosophy from the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa and is a long-standing activist for the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt. She is the editor of The Lost Revolution, Yugoslav Women's Anti-Fascist Front Between Myth and Forgetting, and her research includes issues of German idealism, contemporary French philosophy, feminism, Marxism, the history of race and ethnicity, and the problems of memory in Yugoslav history. Tiana's paper is entitled Losurdo's Nietzsche, Totus Politicus. Our third speaker is Daniel Tutt. Daniel has degrees from American University and the European Graduate School. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Initiation Crisis, Lacanian Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, with the Palgrave Lacan series. His research is concerned with the intersection of contemporary politics, Marxism, and Lacanian psychoanalysis. You can read Daniel's review of Losurdo's Aristocratic Rebel entitled Nietzsche in His Time, The Struggle Against Socratism and Socialism on the Historical Materialism website. Daniel's paper is titled Nietzsche's Political Praxis and the Birth of Perspectivism. So our first speaker will be Ben, and I will hand it over to him. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Harrison. Thanks to the other speakers and to everyone here in this slightly alienated world of the digital. Today, I want to talk about ressentiment, or resentment, the resentful hatred of the weak for the strong that Nietzsche so eloquently and violently described in On the Genealogy of Morals. I just want to first say that, for me, writing on Nietzsche in a critical way, especially after Losurdo's book, is something of a self-criticism. Self-criticism that could apply to at least 15 years of my own work. And I say that just to make the point that the process of reading Losurdo's book is not an easy one, in the sense of also taking stock of one's own critical position and one's own relationship to Nietzsche and to Nietzschean thought. Nietzsche was the first philosopher I read. Biographical point. So doing this kind of reading is something of the task that Gramsci spoke of as compiling an inventory of our consciousness, of the infinity of traces that compose our understanding and experience. So what I want to do then is to think about ressentiment and to consider the kind of future and fate of this concept, which is at once so attractive and, I want to suggest, so problematic. Deleuze remarks that genealogy is the art of difference or distinction, the art of nobility, but it sees itself backwards in the mirror of reactive forces. The genealogy of morals is a book of the triumph of ressentiment, but also the book that claims to overcome ressentiment through the art of difference as the art of the nobility. We should also add that this theme of the resentful hatred of the weak for the strong is recurrent in Nietzsche's writings. In The Birth of Tragedy, we find a very clear statement of the problem of revenge from below. Quote, "There is nothing more fearful than a barbaric slave class which has learnt to regard its existence as an injustice and is preparing to take revenge, not just for itself, but for all generations." Later, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes of the tarantulas, preachers of equality, who are dealers in hidden revengefulness. Finally, in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche will reiterate that resentment born of weakness harms no one more than the weak person. So there is a constant and insistent presence of the analysis of revenge and resentment both before and after the genealogy. To begin classically with a definition, ressentiment, as Sarah Kaufman summarizes, is the fact that, quote, "weak wills can impose their meanings only by reaction, by inverting, disfiguring, and displacing the meaning attributed by the strong." In Nietzsche's own words, ressentiment is a compensation in an imaginary revenge due to an inability to act independently. It is an act of resentment, the victory of the weak over the strong. While reactive, it still remains for Nietzsche an expression of the will to power. And it is the origin of the triumph of the reactive values of Christianity and their present mutation into the forms of socialism and anarchism, when Nietzsche was writing, but still today. Nietzsche was remarkably successful in coining this concept, and it remains influential and dominant. And this includes amongst its targets the left. Nietzsche, always with an eye on the future and the question of his posthumous fate, has had his revenge on us through his own concept of revenge and ressentiment. While formulated as an anti-revolutionary trope in the name of dismissing revolution as mere revenge, we find today that accusations of ressentiment float across political positions. Certainly, we have a continuity of reactionary uses of ressentiment, but in the violent debates around identity politics, decolonization, anti-racist struggles, and perhaps especially in the online milieu, we often see ressentiment used as an explanation and criticism from the left. Jeff Waite has pointed out that the left was often, quote, "unwittingly programmed and manipulated by Nietzsche's thought." And I want to suggest that one of the vectors of this manipulation is an acceptance of ressentiment. This has a particular interest in a context like this, as the notion of ressentiment not only falls on the masses, but also on the role of the intellectual. So I think one important question here is this relationship between the masses and the intellectual that I want to draw out. So what I want to do here is firstly explore Domenico Losurdo's remarks on ressentiment, which are kind of scattered in the book, but make a kind of thesis and an argument. Then I want to turn to the question of whether we should use this concept and how, before finally turning to the issue of whether we can reformulate the concept of ressentiment. And this is something that Frederick Jameson has attempted, what he calls authentic ressentiment, a primal class passion, driven, quote, by the fear of modern people that they have not really lived, not yet lived or fulfilled their lives in a world organized to deprive them of that satisfaction. In this case, we would shift ressentiment away from its anti-revolutionary roots in Nietzsche. Ressentiment would not be the resentment of the masses for their masters, but the resentment of the deprivations inflicted by class society. I want to also raise actually some kind of critical questions around this and whether this can actually be done. I think what I'm focusing on here is ressentiment focuses the question of the influence of Nietzsche, how we might read Nietzsche and how we might respond to him today. So I think that's why I've chosen it as a concept to look at. First then, what does Losurdo say? Losurdo notes how Nietzsche focuses the accusation of ressentiment both on the masses who desire revenge on their masters and on the intellectuals who stir them to action. Resentment is an affect or mood both of the masses and of its organic intellectuals, to use Gramsci's phrase. The intellectual is an arouser and channeler of resentment. That is why, as Losurdo points out, Nietzsche can give a positive role to the ascetic priest in controlling and redirecting ressentiment. So if you remember in On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche has a whole section discussing the ascetic priest, and this is widely taken as a kind of critique, a demolition of Christianity. But in fact, for Nietzsche, Christian preaching of charity and sympathy, insofar as it directs the masses away from revolt and into passive acceptance, is a good thing. So this is important to remember. The Christian priest functions, if we like, as part of the ideological state apparatus, as Althusser would have said. And Nietzsche is happy to support that. So his work is not simply the violent rejection of Christian morality that we're kind of familiar with, especially in its left interpretation, but also the acceptance of Christianity in its pacifying role for the masses. In contrast, the plebeian intellectual is, as Losurdo quotes Nietzsche, a person of rancor, who stirs up the masses, asking them to seek in the ruling classes the cause of his or her being miserable. Losurdo notes Nietzsche's description of plebeian intellectuals as educated swine. And we could, of course, draw the parallel with Edmund Burke's famous description of the masses as a swinish multitude. So there is a parallel here between the intellectual and the masses. It is Rousseau who is the archetypal figure of such an intellectual for Nietzsche. The insistence of Rousseau on equality, on the role or right of happiness for the masses, on the problem of pity and our relationship to others, is an example of a figure who will become a regular in the demonology of the reactionary right, the revolutionary intellectual as figure of resentment. Losurdo also notes the continuity between Nietzsche's denouncing of the envy of the masses as an expression of their own unhappiness and the work of thinkers like Hayek and Mies, who regard any resentment against capitalism as the expression of personal failure. So we're not only talking about arch reactionary intellectuals, but we're also talking about neoliberal ideologists who also read the masses as resentful, but due to their own personal failings. In Nietzsche's thinking, the rancor of the masses must be channeled into self-punishment, while the rancor of the intellectuals must be denounced as a hidden expression of the will to power. Now, Losurdo's argument is not only critical, he also argues that Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment does capture, quote, a real problem of the dialectic of revolution, which is the emergence of demand for absolute egalitarianism, asceticism, and radical leveling. Yet, as Losurdo notes, this is not to accept Nietzsche's counter-revolutionary point that all revolutions are led by envy and result in a destructive and violent leveling. Instead, for Losurdo, the point is that ressentiment is a potential element of revolution that must be dispersed through alliances. And in fact, ressentiment is a weapon of division wielded by the dominant classes. So ressentiment is a way to divide us. If we resent each other, we are no longer resenting them. So Nietzsche's radical criticism of revolution could have a therapeutic value in helping us to consider how to overcome division and forge class solidarity that would not be contained by envy and hatred. So here we can see the attraction and challenge of ressentiment as a mode of analysis and diagnosis. It is difficult to shake the sense that Nietzsche was onto something, while at the same time trying to articulate a rejection of the reactionary politics that ressentiment fuels. To pursue this problem further, I want to turn to Frederick Jameson, who in The Political Unconscious from 1981 had already sketched in some ways some of the points made by Losurdo. According to Jameson, while ressentiment might appear to be a psychological mechanism, quote, it has a more fundamentally political function, which is to explain the phenomenon of revolution. In fact, what we could add is that Nietzsche translates the political into the psychological in a very persuasive way, which accounts for the persistence of this anti-revolutionary trope as a psychological analysis. Deleuze, most famously, inspired by Jung, will present the analysis of ressentiment as a mode of psychological or psychoanalytic typology. You see his famous book on Nietzsche, there's a whole chapter on this. Nietzsche's success has been in disguising political concepts as psychological and rendering politics as a matter of psychology, even if, as here, the psychological is expanded as an expression of the will to power. Jameson, similarly to Losurdo, identifies the analysis of ressentiment as a problem not only of the masses, but also of intellectuals. Once again, it is intellectuals who are seen as the provokers of envy, when their ideological role for Nietzsche should be pacifying resentment. These intellectuals are the, quote, unsuccessful writers and poets, bad philosophers, bilious journalists, and failures of all kinds, as Jameson puts it, in one of those sentences one cannot help but identify with in one or more ways. Again, these compose the demonology of anti-revolutionaries. These are the kind of figures of hatred that we see still persistent and present today. The notion that there might be any real basis for resentment is dissolved into envy as a result of private failure. Jameson goes on to point out, a notable feature of the theory of ressentiment is its unavoidably autoreferential structure. What is represented is the expression of resentment, and so the theory of ressentiment, as he puts it, wherever it appears, will always itself be the expression and production of ressentiment. It is the expression of annoyance of those who rock the boat of class society, you could say. In the case of Nietzsche, this makes us rightly suspicious of all the claims to an independent affirmation, an active force, and a separation from all contact with the reactive. This is a kind of constant trope in Nietzsche, this proclaiming of independence while constantly also proclaiming resentment. If resentment is the act of the weak, then Nietzsche too seems tainted by such weakness, and his attempts to extract an affirmative concept of revenge attest to this difficulty. One other thread I don't have time to discuss is this sort of other concept of revenge that happens in Nietzsche, his attempts to have a kind of noble revenge, which is not particularly convincing. And yet, while this is a neat point, this sort of contradictory structure of ressentiment, it doesn't stop ressentiment working. The advice often given to training therapists is that simply pointing out contradictions in the client's behavior or in the client's words is usually inadvisable and ineffective. We can wonder similarly if simply pointing out that the charge of ressentiment is self-contradictory is sufficient to dispose of this concept. Certainly, we can complicate the charge of ressentiment. Jameson does this by pointing out that not only do we have the Nietzschean ressentiment of the masses for their rulers, but also the envy of intellectuals left adrift for the class solidarity of the working class. So this is kind of flipping ressentiment on its head. This is what we might call ressentiment in reverse. Instead of envy striking at the wealthy or the ruling class, in this instance, we have an envy and resentment of the life of the working class. In a complex reactionary form, such a dynamic is obviously evident in the work of D.H. Lawrence, for example. We also have the case of George Orwell, with his writing a mix of envy, identification, and disgust with the proles. See, not all, but throughout his work. Such an envy for solidarity can also be expressed in more revolutionary forms, such as Engels' own journey to the working class of Manchester. We are, however, used to the critical point that a reversal does not overturn a concept. So once again, ressentiment seems difficult to shake. Simply flipping it may not be enough. Beyond this reversal, Jameson also speculates on the possibility of an authentic ressentiment. This would be a ressentiment generalized to such an extent that it becomes, quote, the guarantor of a divisiveness beyond ideological commitment. That is to say, this is now a ressentiment that is not only the reactionary ressentiment of the have-nots for the haves, or the ressentiment of the haves, or some of them for the solidarity of the have-nots. Instead, it's a resentment directed at class society itself. So this is kind of Jameson's trump card. You know, we can go beyond the Nietzschean dynamic. This is resentment as revolutionary antagonism, in which the alliances Losurdo spoke of are now sought on the basis of an overturning of class society. As Jameson says, this form of class consciousness is one which is intolerable for the bourgeois reader to dwell. It is one in which it is intolerable for the bourgeois reader to dwell for any length of time. It is a resentment beyond typology and psychology, in the form Nietzsche gives it. It is a resentment beyond difference. If we remain with difference as the art of the nobility that Deleuze described, this intolerable ressentiment may at least indicate the point of rupture with the concept. The difficulty here, however, is that this intolerable vision of class struggle recedes, as things so often do with Jameson, into the sublime and unrepresentable. Authentic ressentiment appears as a mere promise rather than an actuality. So what we can see here are some of the difficulties the theory of ressentiment causes. So I've tried to kind of work them through, and I don't say I have all the answers to it, but I've been trying to kind of move through these difficulties. Nietzsche's revenge is to have installed a persuasive theory of revenge into our thinking of revolution. And we could add, in psychology, precisely as a psychologization of the political. Nietzsche has created a persuasive trope connecting revolution, psychological failure, the weakness of the masses, and the rancor of the intellectual. We have traced briefly responses that try to break these chains that operate in the concept of ressentiment. Domenico Losurdo confirms that ressentiment is an anti-revolutionary concept of a piece with Nietzsche's politicization of thought. Losurdo also grants that ressentiment indicates the problem in the revolutionary process in which hatred and violence can take an extreme form. And his solution is the need for alliances to detoxify the divisions and resentment generated by class society. For Jameson, we can not only criticize ressentiment as contradictory, the expression of a violent hatred for revolution that is itself an act of resentment, but also see a true ressentiment that might be developed on the basis of such alliances. The ressentiment appears as a strange, fading vision, intolerable to the bourgeois reader, of the possibility of overturning class society as a whole. While a possibility, it also appears to be a vanishing horizon. What I think is also important to take on board, again, is that ressentiment is a matter of the masses and intellectuals. Ressentiment is what binds the intellectuals and the masses negatively for Nietzsche, in which the potential revolutionary alliance of intellectuals and the masses is a matter of phobic anxiety. And this suggests to me that overcoming ressentiment is also a matter of overcoming the division between the masses and the intellectual, between division between manual and intellectual labor, if you like, to use a kind of traditional formulation at the heart of communist thinking and Marxist thinking. To conclude then, while Jameson tends to see ressentiment as an ideology of the past, I think it continues to have a remarkable success. In a context marked by radical precarity, by successful and dominant capitalism, any expression of dissent is rapidly labeled as ressentiment. The feral competition for status, and so to access to self-reproduction in capitalist society, generates forms of envy and resentment that are often transcoded into forms of ressentiment. This includes on the left as well. In fact, perhaps as the target of such accusations, we are all the more keen to kind of throw them around in almost a kind of way to avoid them. The work of division that Losurdo notes in the notion of ressentiment continues to do its work. And I think the counter to this lies in the suggestion of class solidarity and alliances that Jameson and Losurdo indicate. It also lies in grasping what we might be inclined to read as a psychological category, as a category forged politically as a weapon against the socialist, anarchist, feminist, abolitionist, and other radical movements. It is these gestures, which I suggest as starting points, that may allow us to understand that the real ressentiment is that of the envy of the ruling class, working class solidarity and care, while the authentic ressentiment Jameson speaks of is the ability to develop this solidarity as a class consciousness in alliance with intellectuals and others. And in this way, I think and hope that we might turn Nietzsche's revenge against Nietzsche. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So next up is Tiana. So I will hand it off to her.
Okay, thank you, Harrison, and thank you, everyone, for being here. My presentation, as Harrison already mentioned, is entitled Nietzsche, Philosopho Totus Politicus. Namely, that is the one of the definitions of Domenico Losurdo he defines Nietzsche as totus politicus. When Losurdo uses this expression, obviously one wonders why does he come to define Nietzsche as totus politicus, given that the last, in particular, I would say the period after the Second World War, even though the great merit of Losurdo's book is to have shown that in order to look for the origins of these, what he calls innocent interpretations of Nietzsche, we ought to go back to the 19th century and to start there. However, what I would like to do is to start much later, and in other words, after with the readings that come after the Second World War. Mostly, we are all familiar with the readings of Karl Jaspers, of Hannah Arendt, Leo Strauss, Walter Kaufmann, in Italy, Mazzino Montinari, Giorgio Colli, Gianni Vattimo, in France, Georges Bataille, for example, not to mention some others like Lefebvre, Gilles Deleuze, Michel Foucault, etc. And these are, in a way, all readings which he considers to be part of what he calls the hermeneutics of the innocence. In other words, these are the readings, and this is obviously really the greatest merit of Losurdo's book, the readings that, in a way, try to present Nietzsche as anti-political, apolitical thinker, which has nothing to do with the politics. In other words, Losurdo almost says that they turn Nietzsche into an idiot of some kind, precisely because they want to hide the real sort of impetus of his thought, which is completely political. And this is why he calls Nietzsche totus politicus. Against this sort of image of the hermeneutics of the innocence, which we have to obviously see in its own context, and it is the context after the Second World War, it is the context of the Cold War, and it is the concept of the problem of the generally history of philosophy and historiography, on the other hand, within the Cold War era. So Losurdo, in another text which is published, I think, in 2003 in Belfagor, which is a famous Italian journal of intellectual history, Losurdo actually talks about these readings, and he says we should make an intellectual experiment, and this intellectual experiment would consist in imagining one student of philosophy being taught Nietzsche. If he went to philosophy department, he would have Walter Kaufmann, Bataille, Deleuze, everyone, all the representatives of the hermeneutics of the innocence. If he went to a history department, and this part is entitled The Conflict of Faculties, so he's playing obviously with Kantian terminology. So if the same student who wants to study Nietzsche goes to the Department of Philosophy, from thinkers, that is from historians as diverse as Ernst Nolte, the champion of German historical revisionism, to Eric Hobsbawm, he would learn that Nietzsche is to be sort of put into his historical context, which is the reactionary anti-democratic thought of the 19th century. And this is enough, sort of, Losurdo says, to sort of get a glimpse as to why reading Nietzsche can be so sort of sometimes misleading and difficult, because simply philosophers say one thing, professional historians would say another thing, putting Nietzsche into his own context. This is one thing. Another thing is obviously the European, as it were, debate on Nietzsche in United States, Walter Kaufmann, but particularly in Italy, for example, because as we know, the editors of the collected works of Friedrich Nietzsche in German are two Italians, Mazzino Montinari and Giorgio Colli. The other important, obviously, interpreter, one of the representatives of the so-called pensiero debole, the weak thought, is Gianni Vattimo. And then we have Massimo Cacciari and other Italian philosophers. So besides sort of the international debate, the Italians have had possibly one of the most interesting debates on Nietzsche at all. Now, what's interesting is Montinari in 1975 writes this book, which is entitled What Did Nietzsche Say? Cosa ha detto Nietzsche? And in 1982, Mazzino Montinari publishes a book in German called Nietzsche lesen, to read Nietzsche or reading Nietzsche. And in this sense, one should be reminded that Montinari was a intellectual who always remained close to the Italian PCI. And this is something that one of the pupils of Domenico Losurdo, Stefano Azzarà, reminds us of in his preface or the introduction to the Italian edition of Jan Riemann's Nietzscheans of the Left. Mazzino Montinari writes this book, Nietzsche Lesen, published by De Gruyter in 1982. Now, this book, I mean, it wouldn't be so interesting if it wasn't if it wasn't speaking if it wasn't telling us something about the spirit of its own time. Namely, by 1982, we are deeply sort of entrenched in prevalence, if not altogether victory, of historical revisionism. We know that from the 70s, I mean, even before, from 1960s, you have first text of Ernst Nolte. In France, you have François Furet. In Italy, you already have a sort of a rehabilitation of Mussolini, and so on and so forth. So he writes this text in this book. One of the chapters is dedicated to two interpretations of Nietzsche, namely that of Alfred Bäumler, and the other one is that of George Lukács. Now, what he tries to do, and this is particularly interesting, as I said, because it tells us something about the time and the spirit of the time. He, and Vattimo is guilty of the same thing, and Losurdo shows this in his biography in the book. And a lot of the sort of Cold War interpretations, Cacciari is guilty of the same thing. So many of these interpretations have, in effect, tried to equalize, in a way, Bäumler and Nietzsche, given that the prevalent theory at the time was the theory of two totalitarianisms. And hence, on the one hand, you have a Nazi, one of the main exponents of the Nazi philosophy, and hence ideology, and anyone who merely flicked through Viktor Klemperer knows how important sort of the ideological preparation was for the Nazi propaganda. And on the other hand, they put George Lukács, obviously the destruction of reason, and the idea is to say that these two books are almost the same, except that they differ in value judgment. So one comes from the right, one comes from the left, and hence the circle is closed. Two totalitarianisms are equal. Communism equals Nazism, Lukács equals Bäumler, and this is where the interpretation, as it were, ends. And then we get the Nietzsche, who we cannot even read. And I think there is somewhere in the book where Losurdo says, you know, already Franz Mehring dispels with certain readings when, you know, people claimed that Nietzsche cannot be read, he can't be understood in any logical way, he escapes every concept. Nietzsche is the Aufklärer and Gegenaufklärer. Nietzsche is the biggest thinker of the 19th century, and at the same time the worst, as it were, in a way, thinker of the 19th century. Nietzsche is the thinker of the ressentiment. Nietzsche is the thinker who helps us to overcome the ressentiment. Nietzsche is the thinker, and so on and so forth. So all of these different counterposings of different, as it were, Nietzsche. Now, Losurdo, in one of the interviews, which I think can be found on YouTube, says that his book on Nietzsche should be read together with his book, Liberalism, A Counter-History. And thinking these two, or trying to think these two books together, they indeed depart from the same question. So on the one hand, when talking about liberalism and some of its main representatives, what Losurdo is trying to do, he's saying, well, how can we, and in which ways can we think of these thinkers as liberal? They're professing liberty on the one hand, whereas on the other hand, they are deeply engaged in racist thought. Like Locke, they own the shares of the companies which trade slaves, and so on and so forth. And the same thing, and that is the same question, is applied to Nietzsche. In other words, how can one thinker be, you know, tell me what you need and I'll find you Nietzsche quotation? So how can he be of the farthest left and of the total right? And this is in a way what Losurdo's meaning of totus politicus is also. In 1999, and this is also part of the Italian context, and you know, we should also mention that sort of a smaller, rather small version of this, Nietzsche il ribelle aristocratico, appeared in 1997 for Manifesto Libri. I think it's only 85 pages long, and it was called Per una biografia politica, so Nietzsche per una biografia politica. So this is also the context which, in a way, saw the end of communism on the one hand, the 1989, the 1990s. By the time Losurdo published this, as it were, first version, couple of years later, that is 2 years later, we're going to see the first, as it were, NATO intervention in former Yugoslavia. Losurdo, along with Costanzo Preve and Luciano Canfora and other Italian intellectuals, has actually been one of the signatories of a letter against the NATO intervention in former Yugoslavia in 1999. Gianni Vattimo, in 1999, in Italian La Stampa, replies to this letter signed by various Italian intellectuals and accuses them, as it were, of supporting Milosevic, accuses them and asks them, have you ever not heard from Bosnia? By the way, hello from Bosnia. Have you not heard from Bosnia, about the ethnic cleansing, about the mass rapes that happened there, and so on and so forth? And Domenico Losurdo wrote, to an extent this was a political debate, but Nietzsche was very much involved in it, as it were, which is why I'm sort of bringing this, because it's also part of the overall context that later on brought Losurdo basically to write this massive biography. And Losurdo famously replied to this, and he said, that the pathos, as it were, I mean, let me just replied and concluded thus, I quote, Vattimo deserved his international fame as the interpreter of Nietzsche and Heidegger. Pity he now seems to have lost out of sight an essential aspect of their teaching. Moral pathos can lead to the worst exterminating crusades. Wow, time passes by. So let me conclude two interpretations which are quite similar, which Montinari wanted to put at the same level. One is the Alfred Boimler, the other one is by Lukács. Lukács' thesis, and I think Losurdo sort of shows this really well. If there is one sort of default with Lukács' book, it is that it's too Germanophobic in a way. And Losurdo literally says in the book, Lukács failed to notice how much of German, how much of the French and English Nietzsche had contained in his thought. Alfred Boimler, who Walter Kaufmann, by the way, called the nobody and tried to dismiss him altogether, was one of the biggest popularizers, as it were, of Nietzsche's philosophy. He wrote all the introductions to the Taschenbuch editions in 1930s of Nietzsche's work. And the most important thing, the book is divided in two parts. It's called Nietzsche Politiker und Philosopher. So Nietzsche, the politician and the philosopher. The philosopher, he's obviously seen as someone who's a destroyer of idealism. In other words, Hegel. Nietzsche as a politician is indeed seen, and he says this quite literally in a Schmittian way. Boimler says Nietzsche's most intimate enemy is Rousseau. And if we talk about the way Nietzsche, for example, in some of his works describes Rousseau, he literally talks about Rousseau as a tarantula. He literally says Rousseau is a tarantula, and a tarantula is a sort of an animal that can become this and that. Rousseau is the thinker of the originary equality, and this is the problem. So in the name of equality of nature, Rousseau criticizes social inequality, whereas Nietzsche, and this is what Boimler takes Nietzsche to represent, which is fully in line with the Nazi ideology, Nietzsche sees people as unequal by nature, and hence, as Rousseau sees the civil society as a corruption, as it were, we are all born equal, but the society makes us unequal. For Nietzsche, we're all born unequal, but the society makes us equal. And this was the impetus, basically, for Boimler's book. On the other hand, Lukács, as we all know, tried to put Nietzsche into perhaps overtly German context, but nonetheless within a thought which represented, in a way, the crisis of the modern concept of mediation. So in a way, this is something that brings closer both Losurdo and Lukács. In other words, their understanding of the deeply anti-Hegelian elements in Nietzsche's thought, that is a reaction to Hegel. We can talk about a la Hobsbawm, the dual revolution, the First International, the Second International, the defeat of the Paris Commune, and everything that Losurdo writes about. But this is the second point, which is important. And what is the point of this for Lukács? For Lukács, the irrationalism where he situates Nietzsche is a thought which utterly subjectivizes the historical experience. And this need to subjectivize the historical experience comes precisely from the destruction of the modern concept of mediation, that is, of the modern concept of reason, of enlightenment, of progress. And Nietzsche himself indeed says that the 18th century, against which he fights with instinct, with power and transvaluation, is the century of Rousseau.
Thank you so much, Tiana. Okay, we will hand it over now to Daniel as our third speaker. Thank you, Daniel.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Harrison, for the invitation to be a part of this event. Thank you also for introducing me to Losurdo. This book has been a kind of lightning bolt for me personally. I'd also like to thank my fellow co-panelists, Tiana and Benjamin, for the papers that they've delivered and for their insights. So this afternoon, I'd like to address the aristocratic rebel in two ways. The first will revolve around Losurdo's method. This is a method that gives us readers of Nietzsche a wider context to Nietzsche's thoughts, to his theory, to his concepts. But more importantly, Losurdo's method really reveals what I consider the evolution of central Nietzschean concepts: eternal return, perspectivism, will to power, just to name a few. This is a method that combines philological, philosophical, and historical analysis. In short, it fundamentally changes our understanding and our application of Nietzsche's concepts. The main argument of Losurdo is that to truly get at the core of Nietzschean thought, it requires that we privilege the theme of revolution as the center, put it at the very center, and that revolution and counter-revolution, a reaction to revolution, namely the French Revolution, necessitated the development of a series of strategies that were bent on furthering, putting on the brakes to these impulses across Europe, primarily. Therefore, in Losurdo's presentation, Nietzsche can be thought of as a dialectical thinker in continuous reaction to the revolutionary tradition. The revolutionary tradition found expression in the worker uprisings of 1848, in massification, especially the problem of universal male suffrage in education, the broadening of inclusion of educational institutions, women's rights, and the problem of the ending of slavery. Therefore, Nietzsche should be read as an activist, as a thinker continuously refining both a metaphysics, a morality, and a series of concepts in response to political struggles. Now Losurdo argues the unity of Nietzsche's thought revolves more around history, genealogy, and morality than it does revolve around language, art, and aesthetics, which is, as you all know, the predominant philosophical view on Nietzsche that we have been trained in, both from the French Nietzscheans to the Anglo-American readers of Nietzsche, and beyond, which Tiana, I think, addressed very well. It is important that we take this Losurdo shift in emphasis seriously because it gives us a new rationale of Nietzscheanism. And we benefit from reading the guiding thread of his thought as a reaction to the advancement of modern political equality, as a reaction to democracy and to socialism, because this reading does not ignore the importance of art and aesthetics, but rather situates them in a different and important light. When it comes to those philosophers that do extract political insight from Nietzsche, Losurdo's argument goes against many of the predominant readings, from Brian Leader, who claims there is no political philosophy in Nietzsche, to Hugo Drocon, who argues that Nietzsche's grand politics possesses a trans-historical relevance for any sort of politics, to the French Nietzscheans such as Deleuze and Badiou, who turn to Nietzsche to fashion an ethics and a theory of subjectivity that is vaguely in line with a leftist political project. In the case of Badiou, in line with a communist project. Therefore, Losurdo's reconstruction of Nietzsche should not be understood as a historicist effort that merely shows the extent of Nietzsche's reactionary political commitments to virtue signal him, and then, by extension, guilt us readers of Nietzsche. On the contrary, I think that Losurdo's reconstruction demonstrates how Nietzschean thought contains a theoretical surplus of this reactionary agenda that is not merely an appendage to Nietzschean philosophy, but part and parcel of it. Losurdo asks us whether the revolutionary and emancipatory agendas that we possess on the left are even compatible with Nietzscheanism, and in what ways Nietzschean ideas compromise those commitments. In the second part of my paper, I want to offer an argument on how Nietzschean thought does indeed pervert these core commitments to the radical left. But to begin, I want to start off with a conversation on the Nietzschean concept of perspectivism. Perhaps no other concept illustrates better the ambiguous basis of Nietzsche's contribution to the left than does perspectivism. It is a very well-tracked and very well-developed concept in Aristocratic Rebel, even more so than its treatment of the eternal return or the will to power. Losurdo's analysis of perspectivism is exceptional. It is the best example of how his method of historical, philological, and philosophical analysis can situate a philosophical concept. Now, given that perspectivism refers to the notion that truth claims are fundamentally bound up with one's own perspective, it is hard not to decontextualize the discovery of this idea, i.e., it is hard not to relegate perspectivism to a mere epistemological theory. And we see this often. Perspectivism continues to be celebrated by thinkers who identify it as a precursor to postmodernism, such as Lyotard or Richard Wolin. And as Jeff Waite says, postmodernism might as well be called Nietzscheanism. Perspectivism is at the heart of this turn, and it informs much of contemporary theory, including the neo-pragmatism of Richard Rorty and other liberal anti-foundational philosophies, such as Emerson's. Perspectivism helps us understand the wider appeal of Nietzsche for some thinkers on the left as well, because it implies that a theory of the subject that is capable of eluding representation and circumventing epistemological conventions is indeed what we must be after. For example, in French Nietzscheanism, we frequently find the idea that Nietzsche's philosophy provides a certain ethics of subjectivity, precisely an ethics of self-destruction, of self-overcoming, an ethics that is brought in line with a wider theory of aesthetics and artistic becoming and sublimation. Therefore, at the heart of perspectivism is a rejection of the Enlightenment subject as an agent eligible for universal rights. This form of subjectivity stems from the post-French Revolutionary definition of the human being as one of universal inclusion on a representational basis. Nietzschean perspectivism, and by extension his ethics, seeks to enact an annihilation of this form of subjectivity. Quote, "The task is not who is man, but who overcomes man," as Nietzsche says in Zarathustra. The overman has nothing in common at the level of perspective with the species being of the dialecticians, as Gilles Deleuze writes in his study on Nietzsche. For Deleuze, Nietzsche's perspectivism is a break that sidesteps Christianity, socialism, humanism, egoism, nihilism, and all theories of history that are reliant on the dialectic itself. Perspectivism is thus at the very heart of Deleuze's theory of the subject, a theory which is founded in a split and a rupture, similar to the theory of schizoanalysis that he and Felix Guattari develop, which is very much indebted to perspectivism. Perspectivism is attractive to Deleuze because it opens the way for a new thinking of feeling, of evaluating, and ultimately of legislating values. In Logic of Sense, Deleuze takes up this idea of the destructive Nietzschean subject towards very creative ends, proposing an ethics of living up to one's wound. This is similar in a way to Alain Badiou's reading of Nietzsche's radical gesture of erasing one's proper name in a grand anti-philosophical act. In both instances, Nietzsche is a thinker who provides a set of philosophical insights, not for recentering the subject via the affect of recognition, but is brought into conversation as a philosopher capable of helping us think a radical decentering of the subject. In other words, Nietzsche provides the tools for thinking the subject as radically singular, split apart, and set adrift from representation entirely. Now, what Losurdo's comments on perspectivism provide is a proper context for understanding why the themes of annihilation, splitting, and destruction are so central for Nietzsche. As a doctrine, perspectivism is not merely a theory of the centrality of interpretation over objective reality or truth. It is also part of a political praxis that is bent on nominalizing, i.e. making fictional, the human subject, and by extension, annihilating its basis in universality. I want to get at the heart of why this emphasis on total subjective annihilation is so important for Nietzsche, and why this is also at the heart of understanding Nietzsche's ethical praxis. To properly grasp Nietzschean perspectivism, Losurdo invites us to situate it not merely as an epistemological debate that is responding to neo-Kantian theories of cognition, as the vast majority of commentators have insisted. Perspectivism is rather best read as a concept founded as a solution to a wider debate between realist and nominalist proposals of political truth and political thought that were occurring in a post-French Revolutionary context in Europe. These questions related to questions of historiography, questions of nihilism, and they were deeply in conversation with the budding tradition of historicism as Nietzsche encountered in de Tocqueville and in Taine, amongst many other historians that he read. Now, Taine and Tocqueville, both liberal philosophers, maintained a position of nominalism in contradiction to the Jacobin emphasis on real universals, right? So in a way, the French Revolution reignited the old medieval debate on real universals and nominalism, but in a post-French Revolutionary context, the debate now shifted to a much less abstract set of stakes having to do with questions of the existence of God, to a much more explicit political context centered around the realization of the values of liberty, freedom, and equality, which have now been granted a real stake in political contestation through these various political upheavals. Tocqueville wrote, quote, "Realism is synonymous with socialism and despotism, with the absolutization of the whole with respect to the parts." For Tocqueville, who Nietzsche read closely, nominalism is synonymous with liberalism, and realism is synonymous with socialism. It was Hegelian philosophy that paves the way for socialism, according to Tocqueville and to Nietzsche. Now, Hegel rejects and refutes what Losurdo calls anthropological nominalism. For Hegel, freedom is marked by the construction of the universal concept of man. To quote Hegel, "The fact that today man as man is considered the holder of rights is to be considered as something great, so that the human being is something superior to his status. Now, as the source of law, universal principles are enforced, and thus a new epoch has begun in the world." The Hegelian and later socialist commitment to achieving the unmet demands of the French Revolution insisted, therefore, on the real dimension to political values, and their realization in the world threatened to remove, if not fundamentally alter, the formal liberal commitments to these values. For liberals like Taine and Tocqueville, nominalism was a tempering move to realist impulses. These impulses posed a threat to the very status of the reality of class struggle if they were extended as a weapon of the working masses. In other words, if certain spheres of exploitation and domination, such as the persistence of slavery or wage labor, were to align with realist demands and universals, the status quo would meet its demise. Nominalism was a cover. It was a shelter from these demands, providing liberalism with the means for defending the status quo and maintaining a semblance of order and legitimacy. If these demands or domains of unjust political life had to be supported by appeals to nominalist relativism, the demands of the masses, this raises the question of the status of the human as such in relation to the universal. And this is a topic that Nietzsche dedicates much of his philosophy to. In creating perspectivism, Nietzsche aimed to radicalize liberal nominalism by forging a radical subjective nominalism that was meant to retain a social order based on rank, order, and hierarchy. To quote Nietzsche from Antichrist, "Whom among today's rabble do I hate the most? The socialist rabble, who undermine the worker's instinct, his pleasure, his feeling of contentment with his little state of being, who make him envious, who teach him revengefulness. Injustice never lies in equal rights, it lies in the claim to equal rights. It is the difference around who is eligible to claim rights that makes the divergence in nominalist versus realist proposals of justice. For Nietzsche, the issue at hand is preventing the plebeian slave class, preventing their eligibility to even claim rights in the first place. What perspectivism thus furthers is a political epistemology, a strategy for furthering the social and political conditions where exceptional and brilliant individuals can remain the primary locus of subjectivity. Perspectivism offers a version of the human subject that might exist beyond these abstract demands of rights and representation that undergird the socialist realist basis of the subject. As you may know, the genealogical method Nietzsche develops in Genealogy of All Morals and earlier places the events of the 19th century, especially the crisis of the Paris Commune, at the center of a vortex of history that stretches back to the egalitarian realism of the Jewish and Socratic ideas of the human being, founded in Plato and in the Jewish priests, who both sought to found the individual subject on the basis of their wider social relations, i.e., in consciousness. Later, Cartesian rationalism, like the Socratic theoretical human being, which Nietzsche despised, suppressed an essential truth, namely, that we are not masters of the thoughts that arise in us. Our thoughts do not stem from our intelligence. They rather constitute modes of reaction in which are transmitted old physiological dispositions. For Nietzsche, the forces of nihilist resentment are engendered by the speculative, rationalist, and optimistic worldview espoused by Socratism and later Cartesianism. And it is perspectivism that offers the alternative to this orientation. Now, although Schopenhauer did not share the same aristocratic political agenda as Nietzsche, Losurdo shows that Schopenhauer's nominalism was the basis by which Nietzsche radicalized the idea of perspectivism. For Nietzsche, a society of rank ordering, committed to furthering otium et bellum, or leisure time for those whose lives have turned out well, was the basis of his political praxis. Perspectivism is thus best read alongside Nietzsche's explicit political agenda to, quote, go back by a long and devastating path to ensure that the natural and unbridgeable differences that existed among human beings are once again fully acknowledged by the division of society into castes. Now, as Jeff Waite has argued, Nietzsche's perspectivism aims at a radical annihilation, not merely of egoism, as many psychological commentators have indicated, but more specifically, it aims to destroy and occlude one specific form of consciousness, and that is class consciousness that is proletarian. The political context in which Nietzsche develops this idea is one in which realist commitments to universal rights only lead to dogmatism. By asserting the inescapability of singular perspectives and injustice, this was a way to assert the inescapability of rank order. With my remaining time, I'd like to offer a few remarks on Marx and Nietzsche. Where does Marxism fall in the realist nominalist context that I've tried to outline here? I want to suggest that what makes Nietzsche a perceived comrade to the Marxist left is in large part found in the way that he deals with this impasse and crisis of political epistemology. With this framework of political epistemology in mind, we can gain a better idea of why Marx and Nietzsche have often been thought together. Both Nietzsche and Marx saw wage slavery as a form of slavery. Wage labor was a form of slavery in both thinkers. Being bore an impressive resemblance to a slave, Losurdo notes, for both Nietzsche and Marx. For Nietzsche, the realist camp preached the importance of universality, but the people for whom this universality appealed were only the weak. The weak conceal themselves in the communal generality of the concept human being. For Marx, on the other hand, realist universalism is, quote, in continuity with Christian discourse. The concept of égalité that had emerged from the French Revolution ended up concealing or legitimizing the reality of exploitation and domination. And yet, this idea of equality was still something great. It expressed the unity of human essence for man's consciousness of his species and his attitude towards his species. We thus see that for Marx, as for Hegel, the realist appeal to universalism captures something essential and that is worth furthering. Yet, the realities of exploitation and oppression that most people undergo in capitalism occludes and hinders the possibility for universalism to be realized for all. If perspectivism was Nietzsche's break from this deadlock, we could say that the concept of ideology was Marx's break from the realism nominalism problematic. For Marx, ideology was a way to explain not only how the system of capitalist exploitation and oppression was legitimized at the subjective level, and how the suppression was transfigured as, quote, the fantastic realization of the human essence. Ideology was also, as we know in Marx's famous notion of commodity fetishism, that's one form of ideology, but Marx also, as we know, referred to Christianity as an opium, as an illusion of the masses, which concealed beneath it a real longing for a utopian form of tranquility and equality. Ideology for both Marx and Nietzsche had a direct referent in the way that religion treated suffering. And this was the expression, ultimately, of a real distress and of a real protest against exploitation. Ideology was therefore a solution for the concealment of suffering that went unacknowledged. Marx therefore criticizes the illusoriness of religious transcendence that 19th century working classes relied on, while Nietzsche, for his part, criticized the desire for transcendence, to which this dream and illusion, however confused and unrealistic, gave expression. We thus have two different critiques of ideology. One aimed to blow apart the false flowers on the chains in Marx. The other sought to legitimize the chains of serfdom and rank order, to legitimate the oppression perpetrated by the ruling class. Nietzsche aimed to do away with the very basis of ideological crutches, so that violence and oppression no longer needed to seek legitimation. Marx understood that Christianity's promise of flowers and transcendence concealed a realist demand for a form of life that was denied to the proletariat, which is why he will invent a theory of universality based on this exclusion of the proletariat. Indeed, Christianity was an opium for the masses, a consoling technique, and Christianity was not to be completely abandoned by either thinker. That's important. For Marx, there were conservative limits that Christianity's heavenly equality confirmed, or risk confirming, about worldly inequality. Therefore, Christianity was forced to take on reactionary and conservative tendencies. And Nietzsche was by no means opposed to Christianity to court, by no means. He supported bourgeois and conservative forms of Christianity that reinforced rank order, and he supported, for example, the triumph of European Christianity in the Opium War in China. For Marx, Christianity was a socio-political institution that most often furthered reactionary agendas. But with that said, emancipation from false consciousness does not necessitate a pathos of universal reason for Marx and for Nietzsche. Even though the status of the real dimension of universality was only partially illuminated under bourgeois society, Marx does not, as Nietzsche does, advocate the total abandonment of the universal or the complete nominalization of the realist dimension to values such as justice and equality. For to advocate this would only affirm counter-revolution. How much time do I have, Harrison? 1 minute? Okay. In short, what I think has been very attractive, unfortunately, to left Nietzscheanism is a certain, and you see this very well explicated in Malcolm Bull's Anti-Nietzsche, is a certain proposal that the cathartic moment of revolution is off the table, right? Gramsci had the idea that revolution possesses a certain potential for a catharsis, i.e., revolution holds the potential for resetting resentments and antagonisms, right? That what Nietzscheanism does is it puts the cathartic possibility off the table and swaps that in for a fundamental pessimism and I would say a fundamental commitment to the notion that a minimal degree of inequality is absolutely necessary in any revolutionary situation. So a certain marker of left Nietzscheanism is certain solidarity with that proposal of pessimism. I'll end it with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much to our three speakers. I think it's time to open up to Q&A, to questions that our audience might have. And they could be questions related to the papers, questions also related to the book, questions about Losurdo, questions about Nietzsche. So we welcome those questions in the chat. I do have a couple questions that were sent to us. So I'd like to read the first one, and this is addressed to all of us. Does Losurdo consider in his book how German critical theorists like Adorno, Horkheimer, or Habermas read Nietzsche, and how their readings compare to thinkers like Deleuze, Bataille, Vattimo, etc.? So if any of the speakers want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I mean, I could say briefly that in the appendix, we have a wonderful elaboration, which Tiana mentioned, of what Losurdo calls the hermeneutics of innocence. However, Adorno is not a central focus point there. Adorno's mentioned very briefly. Habermas is mentioned maybe once. The central focus there is Gianni Vattimo. Jacques Derrida's text, Spurs, on Nietzsche's style, is probably the most rigorously analyzed, as well as Foucault is also discussed. In my view, I don't know what you think, Ben or Tiana, it's that appendix which is such a nice invitation for further scholarship in the kind of, like, I would have liked to have seen more elaboration, and I think that it's almost an invitation for people to take up a more scholarship in that same vein. So I would say not much is offered there, but more could be.
So if Ben and Tiana want to talk, that's fine. I might want to just say something really quick. So when Losurdo does mention Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, he wants to focus on how they see Nietzsche as what they call a black sheep of the bourgeoisie. So they're comparing Nietzsche to the Marquis de Sade in terms of the self-destruction of instrumentalist thinking overturning into authoritarianism, which is interesting because usually scholars don't really emphasize those moments in the Frankfurt School, especially the first generation of the Frankfurt School, who do acknowledge Nietzsche as an authoritarian thinker. So you definitely have an acknowledgement of that in Juliet or Enlightenment morality, in Dialectic of Enlightenment, as well as even the young Horkheimer's aphorisms from the Decline aphorisms. That's not to say that Adorno and Horkheimer aren't guilty of what Losurdo would call the hermeneutics of innocence. And if you do want to see an extension of Losurdo scholarship applied to the Frankfurt School readings of Nietzsche, I strongly recommend the epilogue to Ische Landa's Fascism in the Masses, where Landa does a good job pinpointing where the hermeneutics of innocence are in readers like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse. So I just wanted to put that out there.
I think another thing that, could be said, and I think Losurdo sort of mentions this in his book, that Adorno in particular was a, fierce critic of Lukács's Destruction of Reason, and that perhaps could be read as his entree into the hermeneutics of the innocence. I mean, obviously the context is quite different, but then again, Horkheimer and Adorno are also faced with, very sort of quotations from Nietzsche about the what Losurdo calls malriusciti, so the those parts of the race who are the weak, the simply the ones who have, as it were, a hereditary issue, as it were, and those that have to be destroyed. And I think he only mentions this en passant because that's not sort of his principal target, given that he mostly a la Hegel tries to put Nietzsche in his own time, as it were, and to see Nietzsche responding to the theories of his own time, and at the same time conversing with the authors of the 19th century, as it were. And I think it's the biggest merit of the book, in fact.
Move on to the next question. So this question is for Tiana. Tiana, would you like to elaborate more on the relationship between the aristocratic rebel and the liberalism book, A Counter History?
Well, I think, as I said, I mean, it's sort of quite simple. Or let me start from the conclusion. Losurdo, if I'm not wrong, closes the book on liberalism after extensive argument, and he says, only now are we in a position to argue something against the official hagiography, which is an insult to the victims. And one could almost say the same thing about Nietzsche. So the question he poses is the same. So how can a philosopher that is seen at the same time as destroyer and creator, which is what liberalism in a way is, on the one hand, professing the liberty, equality, and so on the other hand, deeply entrenched in the questions of colonialism, racism, just like Nietzsche's thought with Lukács is entrenched within the development of the imperialist phase of capitalism, as it were. So the question that relates these two books is the same. So how can a theory which we all consider to be, and it is also a part of the, how can I put it, the ways we've been taught, everyone has been taught philosophy in a certain way. We've been told that there are certain readings which are objective, impartial, and a la Popper, this is the official line, and then readings like Losurdo's are seen as political. Well, we still have to find out why is Losurdo more political than these people who are trying to convince us that his reading is political, whereas their reading is objective. And this has been part and parcel of the entire project, as it were, after the Second World War. And I think it's very important to have this in mind. So when we talk about Nietzsche, and that's the point that Losurdo explicitly makes, is to say that Nietzsche is philosopher totus politicus, that he can only be understood as a philosopher explicitly in dialogue with political theories of his own time. I mean, with history, with the political events, and everything that's happening. And as I said already, the context is obviously the French Revolution, the Dual Revolution, the First International, the Second International, American Civil War, the fall of the Paris Commune, and all of these things which you can explicitly find in Losurdo's book, and in the end, Nietzsche's adherence to certain racial theories, which precisely are expressed in his aristocratic point of view, as it were. And this is also a question: why does Losurdo entitle the book? Okay, maybe he didn't invent it, but why did he give the book, the title Nietzsche il rebelde aristocratico, so the aristocratic rebel? I mean, on the one hand, we could say, there's an interview where Lukács gets asked whether or not he thinks that Weber, who was his teacher at one time, blah, 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 that Weber would have become a Nazi, And Lukács says, I'm definitely convinced he wouldn't. Now, you could say the same thing about Nietzsche. Perhaps Nietzsche wouldn't have been a Nazi. He would have probably been with the Stefan Georg Kreis, and the people who saw Nazism ultimately as too plebeian. I mean, this is all possible. And this is why I think when thinking about, the contro storia liberalismo, and when thinking about the Nietzsche il ribelle aristocratico, so the same, core is there, and that is the aristocratic moment. So, for example, when he, in the book, Losurdo compares, for example, Mill to Nietzsche and even sees in, the champion of liberal thought, as it were, he sees certain similarities, and that is precisely their aristocratic point of view. Even though it's interesting that Losurdo, for example, does not discuss the subjection of women. And the subjection of women, I mean, it is the only, of all the books cited by Mill, that's the only one that's not cited. And it's quite interesting because the subjection of women opens literally, or quite, similarly, but it opens with the words, Mill says, the 19th century holds, it is the apotheosis of exactly the opposite of the 18th. The 18th century was the century of reason, and it was against the prejudice. The 19th century is the century of the instinct. He literally uses the word of the instinct, of the prejudices. So we value in the 19th century what we held to be completely worthy of every despise in the 18th century. And he, according to Mill, this would be the reason why women are still blah, blah, blah. One shouldn't be fooled, obviously. Mill did not have in view the universal suffrage. He had in view the, extension of suffrage to his own, as it were, class, or to, aristocrats, if we want to use Nietzsche's title. Not quite the aristocrats, but only to a certain land-owning, possessing bourgeoisie, and so on and so forth. So again, you can find differences and similarities, but this is the point of Losurdo's argument in both cases, or at least, it would be one of my lines to follow, basically.
Speaking of reason versus prejudice, I think this is appropriate for the next question. What is the importance of the Enlightenment to Losurdo's critique of Nietzsche? Copy and paste that down below.
Ben, did you want to get that, or I can say a few things about
I'm tempted to say this is Harrison's question.
Yeah.
Harrison has spent most time kind of writing on the Enlightenment and discussing it.
I think Harrison would do a great job taking that.
When I wrote my Enlightenment pieces for Jacobin magazine, I was writing them in tandem with working with Losurdo's book, editing Losurdo's book. So it's really the first 100 pages of The Aristocratic Rebel that hit you that Nietzsche's early enemy as a young Wagnerite is enlightenment, is the hubris of reason. And Losurdo does a good job showing how Nietzsche transitions from this almost national liberal Germanic critique of enlightenment to what he calls a aristocratic enlightenment. Sometimes he calls it a pseudo-enlightenment, because when Nietzsche breaks from Wagner explicitly and wants to reclaim some conception of enlightenment, he wants to limit enlightenment to make room for his own aristocratic project. So what does enlightenment become? It doesn't become an emphasis on equality. It doesn't become an emphasis on democracy. It becomes a skeptical tool to debunk what he calls the illusions of egalitarian revolutions, the illusions of the French Revolution. And then later on, with his proper, mature, aristocratic, radical phase, there is a new critique of the Enlightenment that Nietzsche initiates. And Nietzsche thinks that concepts like causality and Cartesian rationalism, they are afflicted with slave morality, because in order to understand the world, you have to sort of bring everything down to an intelligible level that the masses could, in principle, know. So even this concept of causality, cause and effect, is making equal for Nietzsche. So you can find the political dimension of slave morality even in these very abstract concepts like Descartes' cogito and efficient causality. And it's also in this mature aristocratic radical phase that Nietzsche criticizes Spinoza. He had a weird kind of affinity for Spinoza in the so-called Middle period, I think from his reading of Kuno Fischer's book on the history of philosophy, and he's very enthusiastic to Franz Overbeck that he found his precursor. That changes in the aristocratic radical phase. He even writes this very, I think, anti-Semitic poem about Spinoza that you can read on Ralph Dumain's autodidact project, which he got from Yovel's book on Spinoza and other heretics. So in terms of Nietzsche's own relationship to the Enlightenment, I think it really anticipates in certain ways, especially in the middle period, the kind of watered down positivist Enlightenment reason that we see with new atheism and that we see with people like Steven Pinker, who hate Nietzsche, but actually if they read Nietzsche more carefully, especially the middle Nietzsche, they would have discovered a lot of affinities, including the critique of socialism as irrational, because it's not always socialism as the hubris of reason. In this middle period, Nietzsche takes up Tocqueville, and he takes up these liberal critiques of socialism as irrational, as romantic. So I think that kind of emphasis that Losurdo brings, that Nietzsche is always a critic of the Enlightenment. Sometimes he camouflages himself as an Enlightenment critic, but he's always a critic of the Enlightenment. The other thing about Losurdo's relationship to the Enlightenment that should be mentioned quickly is that he criticizes Gadamer in his book on class struggle. He says that we shouldn't give up reason in favor of this rehabilitation of prejudice, that we really have to defend reason in a dialectical way, not in a positivistic way. And he also defends what he calls a Jacobin Enlightenment. And you also get this sense in the liberalism book that there are certain premises of the Enlightenment that we need to go further and activate that liberalism can't, but certain forms of radicalism can, and of course Marxism can. So that's just what I want to say.
If I can add one more thing, I mean, to do justice to Losurdo, I mean, he even, wrote this little book about Kant called Autocensura e compromesso nel pensiero politico di Kant. So how do you translate self-censorship?
Yeah,
and
auto-censorship. Yeah,
auto-censorship and compromise in Kant's political thought, where he, and it was much in the spirit of time. And one of his teachers and friends, Pasquale Salvucci, wrote another book called L'uomo di Kant, Kant's Man, as it were. And he was, well, intellectually raised, if one can put it this way, precisely in the Enlightenment, leftist, Marxist, school, as it were, defending the idea of the progress of revolution, putting Kant together, so Kant's, as it were, subjective identification with Robespierre, much in line with, for example, what André Tossell did in his book on Kant. So the thought of the Enlightenment, as it were, is not alien to Domenico Losurdo's philosophical project in general. And you can find online even interviews where he gets asked about counterposing Kant and Nietzsche and so on and so forth. And he says, well, obviously, when one thinks about their conceptions of man, Nietzsche, who, as Deleuze somewhere puts it, wants to end the judgment, and Kant, who is the philosopher of judgment, and so on and so forth. These are all, if you don't have judgment, you can't have, by extension, political judgment, and hence Nietzsche can appear to be this, a philosopher that swims in this air and is here and there. So in this sense, Losurdo's book is not a book for anyone and everyone, or for everyone and no one.
Okay, let's ask another question. Given Losurdo's critique, what is still useful in Nietzsche? Other receptions remain as social facts, with influence such as Foucault and earlier Ernst Bloch and Henry Lefebvre.
Yeah, I think this is in some ways, we're talking about this, Harrison, as well. This is a difficult question, not difficult to answer, really, I think, in the sense that as we've started to do here, you have to kind of critically examine Nietzsche's concepts, rethink Nietzsche from the position, as Diana said, suggested, of a sort of total politics, where politics becomes the determinant of thinking, and then trace that as that influences other thinkers, which is why I made that point about my own self-criticism, is that you can be political, as Daniel was talking about, left Nietzscheans, and just to be political does not immunize you from a kind of Nietzschean problem. It falls into exactly what Diana's saying about a kind of hyper-subjectivism. And I think that then is the question to, it's not almost like once we've dealt with Nietzsche, but we then have to deal with the people Nietzsche influenced in this critical way, and go back and kind of frankly and honestly, re-examine them. So to take Foucault, perhaps the most controversial example, just tried to write something that's kind of sympathetic to the late Foucault's work, which has been heavily criticized recently. But you do have to see how strongly Foucault identifies as a Nietzschean, how strongly he identifies with the thematics of the aestheticization of the self. Going back to Daniel's point, that's a heavily political concept. That's the point of Benjamin, to be aesthetic is also to be political. So there becomes a great deal of kind of questions to ask how these things happened, and then how they have become social facts. Why do we accept the Nietzscheanism of Foucault, or of Ernst Bloch, or of Henri Lefebvre, or of Bataille, who I worked on, or literally hundreds of other kind of thinkers and intellectuals. And then before we get to, which is something as me and Harrison have an interest, we could get to popular culture, and then we've got everyone from the film director John Milius to a whole kind of countercultural milieu, which I took as a young person as kind of radical and left, and now I kind of deeply see how it's influenced by Nietzsche. So I think we have to start kind of pulling the thread from Nietzsche, and quite a lot potentially unravels in I think interesting ways and important ways. But it's also quite a shock to come back to Daniel's point. It's quite a shock to kind of do this and start thinking about this whole kind of, to limit it, 20th century culture.
If I could add one thing, when you take, I think Losurdo underlines this, and even Italian, liberal thinkers such as, for example, Norberto Bobbio, one of the greatest Italian scholars of the 20th century, certainly. When you think about, when we think about Nietzsche, and probably after Nietzsche, there hasn't been a single movement of the right that hasn't taken Nietzsche to be, in a way, related, or Nietzsche as their prophet, or Nietzsche as, their whatever. People like Karl Jaspers, for example, in his book on Nietzsche, he claimed, Nietzsche is a philosopher who cannot have followers, because he escapes this idea. There are no pupils of Nietzsche, there are no followers of Nietzsche. But then again, Nietzsche himself actually says, ich bin ein Gesetz nur für die meinen, ich bin kein Gesetz für alle. I'm a law only for mine own, I'm not a law for all. Now, the question that we have to pose in relation to this is not, whether or not the right interpretations are misinterpretations, but why is it that these people find Nietzsche to be their own, as it were? So, we are to the right, or we are off the right, to the extent that our readers are off the right. And I think this is some way we should, read and observe Nietzsche, because the real question is not whether or not these are misinterpretations, but why is it that these people always somehow end up clinging with Nietzsche? What is it that they find in him? And I think the question is, after Losurdo's book, if it hasn't been clear before, rather simple. I mean, you could pose the same question about Heidegger and say, what do we do with Heidegger? Well, the only thing is to have readings which, exactly like Losurdo, put things into their own context and show how certain expressions, be it Nietzsche's expressions or Heidegger's, key concepts, actually evolve or develop from the political struggle or from the political thinking of their own time. And I think, philosophy in this sense has a lot more to do. For example, if you take in Germany, the legal scholarship, the medical history, and so on and so forth, we have fantastic things written about medicine and legal scholarship during the Nazi period. But the silence, as one German philosopher said, the silence of philosophers on all these issues is really remarkable. And I think that's quite fascinating. I think philosophy has a lot more to say and should say.
Yeah, I mean, to mention your point about, kind of thought experiment about what Nietzsche would have done under Nazism. I mean, we've got the case of Ernst Jünger as well, I think would be a kind of very close parallel / identification. not saying that would have been the result, but it's a kind of lived thought experiment in terms of Junger's own aristocratic, aestheticized radicalism.
I would say one thing on Nietzsche's strengths, or like what is left of Nietzsche worth preserving or worth furthering. Losurdo says very straight out towards the end of the text that it is in the historical genealogical method that Nietzsche develops, which needs to be treated well, needs to be treated carefully. He obviously mentions problems with the Foucauldian incorporation of that, but the fact that Nietzsche can now be read as a hyper-political thinker capable of seeing politics where it had never before been seen offers a certain warning to the left, but also a certain necessity to follow the paths that Nietzsche opens. So I would say it remains there as a historical genealogical method, and which is not just reducible to politics, I would say, right? It's still, in my opinion, also the work of examining ressentiment, examining eternal return, examining perspectivism, which Losurdo does in some cases very, very well. Not as much on will to power, but he unearths these concepts in ways which are far more elaborate than Nietzschean philosophers are willing to accept. And I think that there's a lot of work that still needs to actually be done in this way. And when you reach the end of that, I think that you're sort of forced to have an agreement with Domenico at the end of the day. It's very hard to disagree with the argument. And I think that you also have a kind of disavowal mechanism going on amongst a lot of liberal academic Nietzscheans who can kind of conveniently choose not to read this text, which is unfortunate. I mean, I wonder how we can encourage more Nietzscheans in the analytic camp, in the pragmatist camp, and so on, to engage with this text. I wonder what you all think of that. I'm just curious. Something I've thought about a lot.
I think part of the difficulty as well is that what I've noticed in responses to discussions around the Losurdo book is people are also willing to just sort of throw Nietzsche away and say, well, okay, oh, he was terrible, or because it's it's undeniable, although they're not quoted as often as one might expect. You read any book of Nietzsche's pretty much, and there's some, a decent human being pretty much discussed. But people are quite happy to sort of say, well, we don't need any of that Nietzsche stuff. We just need, difference, or we just need some kind of, like you were talking about, which I think was important, perspectivism, or, there's a tendency to kind of adopt the concept still that are Nietzschean while denying any actual connection to Nietzsche. So I think that comes back to Gianna's point about historism, your point about perspectivism. And I think that's why it's so difficult to encourage people to do it, because it is, I know you're interested in psychoanalysis, it is like striking at yourself. It is a kind of striking at your own attachment, your own enjoyment of a figure. And Nietzsche plays on this all the time. Nietzsche plays on your attraction to him as one to danger. He's dangerous, he's dynamite. He explicitly plays on that. So I think there is a kind of difficulty in asking people to treat this as an historical kind of thing, because part of the reason they're reading it is that it has a dangerous edge, and almost there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it is quite, it's an interesting social process,
right?
It's also
a political, cultural process.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Tiana.
No, I just wanted to say it's also, which is why Losurdo's book, it's about taking positions. Once you read the book, there are other books as well. It's about taking a political position, and it's sometimes very different, but that is difficult because it goes not just in some internal psychoanalytical sense, what Benjamin was saying, against yourself. It is directly going against your interests, and this is exactly what Nietzsche teaches you not to do. Exactly what his message is. And I think that's why accepting this book is or accepting that Nietzsche is this kind of a philosopher is not just, your own identification with something that is evil, but it's also about taking a political stance and political position. And that's, I fear, the biggest part of the problem, not just intellectually, but in everyday life, at the level of the everyday praxis.
I would say one more thing. One thing I like about Losurdo in the liberalism book and in this book and in his book on class struggle is he helps us periodize the long 19th century in ways which, as a Marxist, you look at certain debates of utopian socialism versus communism, for example, in the 19th century. You look at them very differently when you take the Losurdo longue durée approach, because you see the kind of contours of the schisms and the battles from a broader perspective. And when you do that, you can actually then think about Nietzsche in the context of 21st socialism and the renaissance of 21st socialism, albeit it's maybe not as intense as it was in the 19th century, obviously. But we sort of have a very interesting interlocution between Nietzscheanism and its irrational vitalism and a kind of liberal academic philosophy, which is silent precisely on those questions. So to me, the Losurdo piece is not so much the far right incorporation of Nietzscheanism, it's the academic liberal philosophical establishment quietude position vis-a-vis Nietzsche, which is even more in line with the dynamics of Nietzsche's own time, right? So that to me is a certain gift. A gift for Marxists to understand a different theory of sectarianism, ultimately, I would say. I don't know, it's something about that makes you go a little bit softer on the utopian socialists than we're trained to do as Marxists.
I think, Lukács is quite right in the introduction to The Destruction of Reason when he says, every thinker is responsible in front of history for the objective content of his philosophy. And I think that is a motto or a credo that we all should accept. Of course, this presupposes that you take certain position and that you question the world in which you live in ways different to what the liberal mainstream has, taught us to do, and to see the world simply as a place in which you have a certain responsibility as both a thinker, a philosopher, neighbor, partner, and at the level of everyday praxis and at the level of struggle, and this is.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. Does Losurdo address Nietzsche's themes of decline and nihilism? I think the short answer to that is yes, but if any of you want to comment.
I think people should read the book, buy the book, read the book, and I think that's the go through the argument yourself. Yes, he does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one thing that might be helpful in the future is the translation of the earlier, shorter political biography that Losurdo wrote of Nietzsche, and that's more of the menu before the meal, so to speak. But I think it would be good to give people a taste, because maybe it's hard to sit down and just read a thousand pages.
But it's very readable. It's very readable.
It is, absolutely. It's readable. It's riveting. It's transformative. I implore people to read it. And I don't think that the 100 pages or the 80 pages of the smaller book is a substitute, but it might help the ball. It might help get the ball rolling.
One quick thing on nihilism. One nice thing is that, when you read a book like Nietzsche and Philosophy by Gilles Deleuze, the distinction between passive and active nihilism is almost granted a kind of trans-historical status. And what's nice is that Jacobin nihilism is different than kind of liberal statist nihilism. And therefore, it's an example of how Losurdo can contextualize that very important distinction, right? So that when you read a book like The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama, which is a Nietzschean Hegelian synthesis, and he talks all about nihilism, you sort of get a fabulous contextualization in the long 19th century to understand like how these distinctions were derived in real time, right? So part of the hermeneutics of innocence is to take Nietzsche at his word that the genealogical project was truly a trans-historical project. And to an extent it was, but in many ways it was not, right? So that's one thing on nihilism that I liked.
Any other responses? Any other questions? Okay. Let's see. Thank you, John. So here's the question. Does Losurdo extend the concept of totus politicus also to the young Nietzsche, professor of philology with a strong concern about education? Does Losurdo agree with Lukács? Thank you. Great debate. Thank you.
Can I answer this question?
Yes, you may.
Yes, he does. He extends the, so he sees the entirety, as it were, of Nietzsche's philosophical project as a political project. So in this sense, he definitely sees young Nietzsche involved in the same political debates, and the arguments and the quotations and everything that he provides in the book actually speak for themselves, from the birth of tragedy onwards. And another thing, does he agree with Lukács? Well, the answer is sort of yes and no. So there is a lot of Lukács, obviously, in Losurdo's book, and not just Lukács of The Destruction of Reason, but Lukács and his essays on fascism, also from 1930. So these two principal works, as it were, where he does not agree, or where he thinks Lukács should be complemented, I would rather say, you know, that he thinks that Lukács should be complemented. On the one hand, as I mentioned, he sees Lukács as being too German in his interpretation and failing to understand the spirit of the time, as it were, both the American, the French, and the British political and intellectual climate of the time, which is what he's doing, and Nietzsche's direct replies, as it were, to the American Civil War. And that is precisely what he's trying to do. So like in the Liberalismo contro Storia, he's trying to sort of extend the story to the history of colonialism as well, in this sense, and to show that Nietzsche is not, you know, immune from these debates either.
Mm-hmm. And briefly, the most important contribution of Losurdo, apropos the early Nietzsche, is a serious consideration of a lecture on Socrates and tragedy that comes up before Genealogy of All Morals, which really blatantly reveals his anti-Semitism and the way that that links directly, I mean directly, to anti-socialism, which commentators didn't have that before this, really. It wasn't really in the conversation. Very significant.
So one more question, and then I think we'll wrap up. So this person was wondering about Losurdo's book's influence after its release in 2002. Has it had any presence in Nietzsche's studies, especially in Anglo-American academic texts?
I'm not a good person to comment because I am not officially employed as a philosopher, nor I'm Anglo, I guess. But I have, you know, I mean, part of the point of the translation and this, which was, you know, monolingualism, and the debate is that I think it doesn't seem to have had much impact. There has, as Harrison's mentioned, and he can name more names than I can, been lots of, sort of parallel work that explores similar themes. Dombrowski, Timothy Brennan's done some work. So I think there is a kind of emergent consensus, alternate consensus, starting to emerge in Anglo-American studies of Nietzsche, but it still seems to me, relating to the point Gianna made about politics, marginal. You know, it's marginal to that politics, which often claims to be radical, not just liberal, but it's still marginal, I think, to the dominant interpretations. I've seen, I know more of the kind of French, Anglo-French theory type receptions, and it seems to have been sort of non-existent there, and I'm not confident that it will have existence there, because it's such a deep challenge to that kind of way of looking at things.
Yeah.
So I think that's the stakes of what we're trying to do in some senses. Open a reception.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be fabulous if this could penetrate French Nietzscheanism. That's a very well concealed vessel of thought, but you never know. And there's reasons people try to kind of easily dismiss the text. I think Harrison and I noticed Peter Sloterdijk dismisses it as a kind of Trotskyist text, because Trotsky's first publication was a screed against Nietzsche, actually. And in some ways there is a kind of similarity there. Yeah, you know, I think that that this will be making a big splash in the Anglo. That's my hope. Although Tiana and Harrison, I don't know if you are as optimistic as I am there, but as I was saying, I think there's a relationship between the kind of interest in socialism and this perspective on Nietzsche, which will itself hopefully influence a new generation of scholars.
I am cautiously optimistic, but emphasis on Spinozan caution for me. And yeah, Tiana, did you want to say anything about this?
No, I'm just, I share your cautious optimism, and would tend to sort of, you know, agree more with Lukács. That is the fundamental thesis of his book, The Destruction of Reason, as the utter subjectification, as it were, of historical and every other experience, and the complete dismissal and the impossibility to understand the totality, the objectivity of historical processes. And when we think about today and, you know, in all parts of the world, I think we're all sort of faced with similar, you know, movements, ideas, the new right, the alt-right, the conspiracy theories, and all these things, which obviously, you know, with Lukács, one should not think, you know, as an individual problem, but precisely as the problem which is deeply related to the impossibility of representing the system, as it were, objectively, and hence people are, you know, pushed to the complete subjectivization, which is what then leads to these various things, which then we should see as a consequence rather than a cause in and of itself of wider societal and political problems that we are faced with.
Great. So I just want to emphasize to the audience, this is the book. It came out, I think, officially today, so you can get it through Amazon. And I exhort you, I implore you to get and Haymarket's website, and I urge you to get a copy of this book. It will definitely be a milestone read in your intellectual life. Thank you so much. And thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harrison.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions.